Okay, so what questions do you have? Ready to go for the final, our discussion of the final exam review? I tell you what, while you are organizing your thoughts, you should have things ready to go, right? But while you pull that out, let me just remind you, I know I said this in the last class session, but I'll just go ahead and say it again. Your final exam is 1 week from today. Remember that there's an unusual start time, right? You're used to coming in this classroom at 12:15 or starting class at 12:15. Start time is actually 12:30, okay? Please be here on time, okay? The department, I think I've intimated to you all that this is a departmental exam, right? The department's pretty protective of the exam, and one of the things that they really like to have happen, or not to happen, I guess is a better way to say it, is for faculty to distribute final exams to people who come late, okay? So I follow the instructions I'm given, right? So please be here on time, ready for the final exam at 12:30, okay? You'll need to bring a Scantron form 882, I think we said the form number is, right? And don't forget your number 2 pencil. Yep, that's it, okay? And that's all you'll need on 1 week from today is that Scantron form and a pencil. I will pass out the exam on test booklets on paper. We won't be doing them on the screen. So what else can we say about that?
We don't have a class on Tuesday, correct?
No, this is our last regular class session.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into substantive questions that you have. Who wants to lead off? The leadoff batter sets the table for the rest of the lineup.
What about the unitary, confederal, and federal systems comparing contrast?
Are you taking something directly off the study guide here? Which SLO are you on?
That one, SLO2, the first one.
The first one. Oh, yeah, we actually talked about this some in the class material on federalism, although I think for you guys that was the week of the freeze.
Yeah.
So that gives me an opportunity, by the way, just real quick here to remind you that for those of you who haven't done the week 5 quizzes yet, you have until the end of the day on Saturday. Right?
See, you guys are local. Me asking that question.
Okay, so I'm not going to re-lecture this material, but I'm just going to very quickly say that this is a distinction that we make when we talk about different systems of government around the world. If we had a world map that we could look at, we would find that there are overwhelmingly two dominant types, okay? The question of whether you have a unitary system or a federal system, those are the two. I throw in confederal here because it helps to provide some point of departure, okay? Most countries in the world today have either a unitary system or a federal system. In fact, there's really only one country that it's not even really one that we would call a confederacy. It's just kind of hard to pin down, okay? Or at least has been in recent years, and that's Somalia. But it has to do with the relationship between a central government and regional governments, okay? So everywhere on the face of the earth today where you have a country, you're going to have a central government, and then you're going to have some regional governments. And the real issue is, what is the power relationship between the central government and the regional governments? In a unitary system, the central government has the powers, and it may delegate down to the regional governments some functions, administrative functions, for example. And that's the most common type. There are more countries that have unitary systems than federal systems. So good examples would include countries like Great Britain, Japan, France. When you look at that material from week 5, you'll see a few other examples. So in those countries, all the power really rests with the central government. And then, as I said, they may delegate some functions down to some regional governments. In Japan, for example, the power is with the national government in Tokyo, right? And then they have, I think, something like 98, they call them prefectures in Japan. And they sort of administer, on a local level, but only what authority is given to them by the central government. Okay? The reason I throw Confederacy, the reason I throw Confederacy in with these two, even though it's not really something you find, certainly today, is that it's sort of the opposite arrangement. In a confederal system, the power rests with the regional governments, and they may delegate some authority up to a national government or a central government, right? But the central government only has authority that's given to it by the regional governments. Most examples of confederacies that we might come up with, they're few and far between, but they're going to be principally historical, right? So, for example, the United States from the period 1776 to 1789, before the Constitution went into effect, was a confederacy governed under the Articles of Confederation, right? But the reality of the situation is that each of the individual states, Virginia and New York and Pennsylvania and Connecticut and whatever the other 13 states were at the time, they really that's where the power was, right? That's where the decision-making power was. And there were a few functions that were delegated up to the Congress of the Confederation, but it was very, very limited. The Americans figured out pretty quickly that that was an arrangement that was not going to work, okay? Which is why they drafted the Constitution to form a more perfect union. And of course, that really began the process of moving the United States from a confederacy to a federal system, okay? So again, it's primarily historical, but I throw it in here really for context so that we can sort of have something to play a unitary system against, right? They work in opposite directions. In a unitary system, power is at the central level, and some authority may be delegated down to regional governments. In a confederacy, the power is with the regional governments, and some authority may be delegated up to the central government, okay? The United Nations today, the United Nations would be an example of a confederacy. The United States, Russia, China, Great Britain, that's where the power is. So with the regional member nations, constituent parts. And they delegate some functions up to the United Nations, but most, certainly Americans, would say that as world governments may go, the United Nations is pretty weak and ineffectual. Because none of those nations are going to surrender their sovereignty to the United Nations as a world government. Okay? Now, a federal system is different in a very important way. You can kind of think about a unitary system and a confederacy as being opposites of one another because power flows in opposite directions. But in a federal system, it's different. It's like a different animal because in a federal system, both the central government and the regional governments have autonomous authority in and of themselves, right? So the United States is a federal system, obviously, but there are many other federal systems in the world. Canada is a federal system. Germany is a federal system. Okay, again, you can get other examples from the material. But what the characteristic is that they all have is that both the national government or the central government on the one hand and the regional governments or the states on the other hand, both they get their authority from a constitution. In the United States, for example, the states don't get their authority from the national government, and the national government doesn't get its authority from the states. All right? That's the key. There are some other characteristics that I go through in that material, and you need to be familiar with them, but that's the key difference, I think. If I had to pin down one thing just for the purposes of this review session, is that you need to understand that in a federal system, as opposed to a unitary system where the regional governments get their power from the national government or the central government, in a federal system, neither get their authority from the other. They get their authority from ultimately the people, but how do we know what powers the people want the national government to have? How do we know what powers the people want the state governments to have? Well, they divided that up in a constitution, which begins with the words, we the people. At least in the American experience, right? Okay, so I hope that helps. Okay, but you definitely, X, will want to make sure that you review that material. That's why I say, you obviously, when your professor has a policy of dropping 4 quizzes, you have some discretion. I worry about that. One of the reasons I worry about that is because each of you individually kind of get to decide which material you want to de-emphasize. And that kind of rubs me the wrong way, because I think that, well, I've been around a long time, doing this a long time, and maybe I ought to direct you as to, what material you can or can't set aside. But anyway, that's the point, is that some of you may just choose not to do that week 5 material. You're economizing on your time, and you just want that to be one of the lowest 4 that gets dropped. The downside of that is it's subject to testing on the final exam too. Right?
Can you maybe clarify the difference between Hamiltonian, Jeffersonian, and Jacksonian?
Oh my gosh. Please.
We talked about that in the context of a philosophy of constitution making.
Yeah.
And remember, I told you that the U.S. Constitution, which was drafted in 1787, and many of the state constitutions among those original 13 states that existed in the late 18th century already, when the Constitution was drafted, they tend, it's not across the board, but they tend to reflect the philosophy that underlies the U.S. Constitution, which I label Hamiltonian, Madisonian republicanism. Now, the reason that I choose that term, you're not going to see that in any other textbook or any other source material. I choose that Hamiltonian / Madisonian republicanism just as a way to play off the other philosophy of constitution making, which is Jeffersonian, Jacksonian democracy. You do see Jeffersonian or Jeffersonian / Jacksonian democracy in textbooks or other source material. So I just kind of wanted to have something to play off against that concept. Well, whether other sources use my terminology or not is irrelevant. The point is that most political scientists are going to tell you that there's a different philosophy underlying the U.S. Constitution. There's a different philosophy of constitution making underlying the U.S. Constitution than there is underlying states like Texas, which are based on this Jeffersonian, Jacksonian philosophy, okay? And the main point that we distinguish between is it a document of general provisions? Is it a general framework for government? It kind of sets up government and then assumes government is going to make specific governing decisions? Or is it a document of detailed provisions where the Constitution itself, it deals with many of those specific policy issues, okay? The Texas Constitution is of the latter, right? Because in part, a big part of the explanation for why it's so long and why you have so many amendments. Just think about that. When you think about, as you're preparing for the final exam and you're thinking about this, difference between the U.S. Constitution and the Texas Constitution, maybe just ask yourself, keep asking yourself, why is the Texas Constitution so much longer than the U.S. Constitution? The quick answer that I'm trying to give you is that, well, it's the reason it's so much longer is because there's a completely different philosophy of constitution making that underlies it.
Isn't the U.S. Constitution is everything you cannot do? They say everything you cannot do, and then the Texas Constitution says everything you can.
Yeah, I mean, look, we did say that in class, right? I mean, I do say that every semester to groups of students, but I want to just caution you that it is, it's not unequivocal. I mean, it's like there's some wiggle room there. And like in a lot of the things that we talk about, for example, the theory of the U.S. Constitution is that the national government, each of the branches of the national government, only have the authority that's delegated by the Constitution. That's been a big point of debate as specific issues arise over 200 plus years of our history of American national government since the Constitution went into effect. The upshot is that even though that is the theory of the U.S. Constitution, technically the theory of the U.S. Constitution, there are some provisions in the U.S. Constitution that suggest that the powers of the national government are more expansive. Most notably, most importantly, is the so-called necessary and proper clause, or sometimes it's called the elastic clause, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's referred to as the doctrine of implied powers, right? Sometimes it's referred to as Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, okay? And it's the clause that says Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to carry into execution all of the other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States. So that when specific questions have arisen over the years, can Congress pass a minimum wage law? Oh, that's not in the Constitution. You're not going to find anything in the Constitution that says Congress can pass a minimum wage law. But the courts have said that Congress really does have the power to pass a minimum wage law because Congress has the power to regulate commerce, and then it has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to carry into execution its power to regulate commerce. And if that means enacting a federal minimum wage law, it means enacting a federal minimum wage law. If it means requiring individuals to have health care insurance, it means requiring individuals to have health care insurance, right? So you understand what I'm saying? That even though, if we went back and looked at the historical documents and the debates over the United States Constitution from the late 18th century, what you would find is this pretty consistent and widely held view that the national government only has the powers that are delegated by the Constitution. But the way that it's actually worked out, because of the elastic clause and a couple of other provisions of the Constitution, that the powers of the national government have been more expansive, it really comes down to, in practice, it means that the national government really has plenary powers. Right? That word plenary, I think I introduced you to that earlier in the semester. P-L-E-N-A-R-Y. What does that mean? Well, that means that as long as it's not specifically denied, okay, and as long as there's some basis in the Constitution, then the national government can undertake that authority. So that's why we put the U.S. Constitution in the category of a document that emphasizes denials of authority. There are some things that we know that the national government just can't do because they are denied that authority. For example, most obviously, if we look at the Bill of Rights, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. You all would know right away, if the Congress of the United States tried to pass a law declaring the Catholic Church the official church of the United States, you would know, right, hey, they can't do that. The Constitution prohibits them from doing that, right? Some of it's real clear cut, but a lot of it is not as clear cut, right?
Yeah.
So as long as it's not specifically denied, and there's some reasonable basis in the Constitution for the national government to undertake that authority, that's what I'm calling Madisonian Hamiltonian republicanism.
And
Okay?
are there repeated things that are in the Texas Constitution because they've put it in so much? Or do you think so? Or?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. I will say, my instinct is to say yes, because we have so many provisions in the Constitution that deal with things like that are just like updating or reworking what already exists in the Texas Constitution.
But they have to add it to update it and
Yes.
rework it.
Yes, because of the specificity that's there from the word go. You have to. Now, look, that could all be changed by writing the new Constitution, but we haven't really had a good effort to do that in a long time in Texas, even though many, many people in Austin, Republicans and Democrats alike, will tell you that Texas Constitution is outdated, outmoded, and can be very difficult sometimes for the operations of state government, in some cases local government as well. But the political will is just not there to fundamentally, to write an entirely new constitution and fundamentally change the philosophy.
Seems like no one's got time.
Well, people, Texans are not unique in this regard, but I think it's certainly true. Many Texans, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But some people might say in response, well, it is broke. You just don't see that it's broke.
I mean, I kind of like how the government does kind of like, it involves more people in it. It feels like to me that more people are involved with the whole policy making of the state because, for example, amendments go through the people.
Well, yeah, and I think that's part of the philosophy that the framers of the Texas Constitution had back when they wrote that document in 1875. Now, what some critics are going to respond to you, Miles, is say, yeah, but most of those amendments only, less than 10% of voters in Texas vote on those issues. So what you really have are important decisions being made by a small minority of Texans.
And that minority of Texas could be, I mean, like, I don't know, I just feel like if I knew that 10% were gonna vote, only 10%, I would try to sway that 10% as much as possible.
Well, I think what some critics will say, that's an interesting way to think about it. I think, though, what a lot of critics are going to say is that the people who turn out in that small single-digit percentage, the people who turn out tend to be the people that have a vested interest in the outcome.
Yeah.
An immediate and direct interest in the outcome.
My interest is-
Whereas the overwhelming majority of Texans don't see an immediate and direct interest in the outcome, even though it may affect them. They just don't perceive that immediate and direct interest. And as a advocate of rational apathy, this may strike some of you as heresy. I'm not supposed to say this kind of thing, but I understand why people don't vote in those elections. Right? I mean, after all, if you don't see how something is related to you, why should you? I think there's a good argument in favor of rational apathy. It's not a disease, it's like not voting is not a disease. But the problem is that oftentimes people really are affected, even if they don't know.
Yeah.
What kind of bothers me usually is when people vote and they do it for, and I know I have no control over it, they totally have the right vote. It's just when they vote for someone that seems very superficial, like it doesn't have to policy make or anything, they just what sometimes it's like very not very good reasons. Like I just wish they would do more research on it.
What else? What else have you guys got? Christopher, you got one? You look like you're earnestly searching for something. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
How about this one? The historical importance of traditionalistic political and conservative ideology to public policy making in Texas.
Which SLO?
5.
The third bullet point?
Mhm.
Well, what is it that you don't understand about that? I mean, what is it that you're unclear about? Let me ask you a question. Is traditionalism as a political culture type equivalent to or synonymous with political conservatism?
Yeah.
Actually, no, it's not.
No.
Those are not synonymous concepts, okay? Now, it just so happens in Texas, we have this very traditional political culture, and we also have historically had a dominance of conservative political ideology. Okay? But all throughout that period, certainly over the last 100 years, let's say, even though Texas may be dominated by conservative politics, conservative ideology, you have had progressive elements of the progressive elements in Texas. They just haven't prevailed. But we've had, going back to at least the 1930s, a progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And we've had a few people elected who we don't even have to qualify by saying, well, by Texas standards. We don't even have to say by Texas standards, by national standards. We're very progressive politicians. You know, Lyndon Johnson, who gave us the Great Society, was a Texan, born of that progressive wing of the Texas Democratic Party, right? Although in some ways he was as traditional and good old boy as you can imagine, you know, like. So that's, I think, the first thing to understand about that is that they're not synonymous concepts. So what this one is really trying to get you to think about is in, you know, what respect does Texas have a traditional culture and also, you know, the dominance of conservative philosophy, conservative ideology. What else? Yes, Chris?
Okay,
I knew you had, I could tell you had one. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was looking for it. Okay, so general law city and home rule city.
Okay, you just generally, what in the world happened? You just generally don't understand the distinction, or,
Get them mixed up.
okay? Well, general law cities, and okay, what we're talking about first of all are cities, okay? Incorporated municipalities, okay? There are two types in Texas. There are those that are governed under the general laws of the state of Texas. In other words, their mayor and city council really don't have a whole lot of local decision-making authority, okay? Whereas in a home rule city, the mayor and the city council, as the elected officers of government, do have quite a bit of authority to determine local laws, okay? And, you know, I think the example that I always come up with initially to illustrate this point, and the reason I think about this one initially is because I think it's so simple everybody can kind of understand it, right? In a general law city, the city council, the mayor and the city council, for example, doesn't have the authority to set the speed limit. It's governed. You drive through a little town like Needville or something like that, depending on the road that you're on, whatever the speed limit is set at, that's determined by the legislature in Austin. And it would be the same in Needville as it would be in Buckholz, Texas, as it would be in, you know, any of these other little bitty towns that we have around the state of Texas. They can't change that locally. They can't say, oh, well, what, you know, the state sets it at 30, but what we'd really like to do is slow people down to 20. So maybe entice them, now that we've got them slowed down to 20, maybe we can entice them to go into local businesses and buy things. Whatever the thinking might be, I don't know. But they can't do that because it's governed under the general laws of the state of Texas. On the other hand, in the city of Sugar Land or the city of Richmond or Rosenberg, just to stay pretty local here, there are home rule cities, okay? And they can change the speed limit. So city of Sugar Land can set the speed limit out here on University Drive at 45, which it is currently. I drive down that every time I come to this campus, right? So I'm going to testify in court that the speed limit up there is 45, right? But the city of Sugar Land could, if it so chose, if the city council chose to do that, they could raise that or lower that. Okay, so that's the simplest example that I think everybody can kind of appreciate. But it's certainly way beyond this. There's much way beyond the speed limit that would be affected. the general idea here is that in home rule cities, they can make local laws, they can make policies, ordinances, they call them, locally. In general law cities, they're just governed by whatever the legislature in Austin determines. That help? And what is the initial distinction, or what is the initial qualification for a city to be a home rule city? The size of the population, and do you remember what the number is? At least 5,000. So I'm pretty confident that Needville is a general law city because I'm pretty confident that the population of Needville is less than 5,000. I could be wrong. Maybe I haven't driven through Needville enough. Is it what? Is it? Oh, yeah, I could be wrong. Okay, I hope that helps.
So, we were covering taxes. I don't think we went over flat tax.
We didn't. At least if we did mention it, it was just in passing. And is that indicated here on one of the under one of the SLOs?
Number 8.
Differences among progressive.
Yeah, I mean, I do have a memory of just, very in passing sort of mentioning a flat tax, the idea that, the debate over taxes tends to be about fairness, your concept of fairness versus his concept of fairness versus her concept of fairness versus my concept of fairness, or Democrats' concept of fairness versus Republicans' concept of fairness, or however you want to think about that. The debate over whether we're going to have a progressive tax or regressive taxes or some sort of proportional tax or a flat tax is really about how people perceive fairness. There are some people who will argue the most fair thing that you can do is just apply the same tax rate to everybody, a flat tax rate. If you can bet, and at first glance, I think to many people, maybe who haven't thought about it much, well, of course, that is the fairest way to do it. Just apply a flat 15% maybe, or whatever the percentage is, to everybody's income. Isn't that the most fair thing to do? Many people would argue, but I think the critics are going to snap back at that pretty quickly and say that whatever that rate is, and I just arbitrarily picked 15, 15% of somebody who is at the lower end of the income scale is felt more than 15% of somebody who's at the upper end of the income scale. And they're probably going to be advocates of a progressive tax. It's more fair, okay, to tax people at the lower end of the income scale at a lower rate and people at the upper end of the income scale at a higher rate. So it's all about fair. And, like I think I mentioned to you all in class, fairness is something that can't be measured, right? It's really about people's political perspectives. So that's all I really wanted to say about flat taxes at the time. And I think all I would really say here now in response to your question is it's just one other way to impose a tax rate based on someone's concept of fairness.
It's like Russia actually, a flat tax.
Some economists will say that the most efficient tax that you could possibly have, and maybe also the fairest tax that you could possibly have, is what they call a head tax, okay? Or what they called in Great Britain quarter century ago or so, a poll tax. It's not the same kind of concept of a poll tax like we talked about here. It's really what economists would call a head tax, which means that everybody just pays a certain amount for being alive, right? And they say that some economists say that that's the most efficient kind of tax you can have because it doesn't provide incentives for people to hide income. You see, if your tax base is income, people have an incentive to hide income, or they have incentive to not report income, or they have an incentive to, disguise income or whatever, Like, I remember having a conversation with somebody, I won't tell you who, who was a server in a restaurant who was complaining about taxes, and I asked this person, you know, do you report all of your tips? No, I don't report all my tips. I would be a fool to report all my tips, right? Well, this person has an incentive to hide income, right? And of course, I respond to that person, you know, every dime I've ever earned has been subject to the tax. How's that fair to me? Every penny I've ever earned has been subject to the tax, and you're hiding income. So, you know, the question about fairness is a difficult question, but as I say, I think some economists would say the only way that you can sort of really get to anything approaching fairness would be to have a tax that's not based on income, that's not based on consumption, but just on being alive. Kind of like in the Christian New Testament, right? Where Caesar ordained that all the world should be taxed. That was a head tax.
Okay, so the meaning of the term long ballot, I don't remember if we ever went over that. I don't remember.
I think we did. Again, it might have been one of those deals where we didn't spend a lot of time with it, but we talked about it in the context of the Texas Constitution reflecting that Jeffersonian, Jacksonian democracy. It's just the idea that we elect so many officers in Texas. It's a long ballot. If you put all the offices on the same ballot, now we elect certain officers some years, you know, in like presidential years, we don't elect a governor in Texas, right? Some offices we elect in 2-year intervals, some we elect in 4-year intervals. But if you could put all the offices and the candidates for those offices on the same ballot in Texas that we see in Texas, that would be an exceedingly long ballot. You would see candidates for president, you would see candidates for U.S. Senate, you would see candidates for U.S. Representative, you would see candidates for state House, state Senate, governor, attorney general, comptroller of public accounts, railroad commission, state board of education, all the state judges, all the county offices, right? You would be in the voting booth a long time.
It just means like putting everybody on like one single ballot.
Well, no, I'm just using that as an illustration just to kind of drive home the point about we elect a lot of people, you know? The long ballot just means that a lot of the offices that at the national level would be appointive offices, and even in many states would be appointive offices, we elect them in Texas. And that is a reflection of that Jeffersonian democracy, that faith that existed in the early part of the 19th century, you know, through the middle part of the 19th century, that state constitutions were based on, that sort of expresses a lot of faith in ordinary voters to make these decisions.
Did we cover on SLO 8 how poverty differs among various segments of?
We did not in class, okay? It is actually a topic that is most specifically related to what we had originally planned for week 15 before I made the decision to just have review sessions for week 15. Certainly it's something that we would have covered in class, something that's covered in the textbook in the chapter that would have been for week 15, right? So let me just say this, to the extent that earlier chapters in the textbook, maybe chapter 1, for example, might have dealt with that. Otherwise, you know, we didn't get into that in any real systematic way. Well, I think what it's really getting at, Miles, is it sort of tempting you to think about this in demographic terms. So, like what would be some of the demographic factors that we would associate with higher levels of poverty or lower levels of poverty? Maybe along racial and ethnic lines, maybe along educational lines, et cetera. Yeah. What else?
SLO 7.
Okay.
It says on whom the burden of proof lies in a criminal trial.
Ah, yeah.
What is that burden of proof lies?
Well, this one,
burden of proof lies in a criminal. Okay, I get that.
in other words, what it's
Yeah.
getting at is to see if you understand whether the defendant has to prove his innocence or the state has to prove his guilt.
Oh, okay.
That's really all it means. And also, it says a criminal trial here, but you might also think about it in contrast to a civil proceeding.
Yeah.
What is the burden of proof in a civil? Do you know what the burden of proof is in a civil proceeding? So what?
No, I know.
So what is, if you had a question on the exam, on whom does the burden of proof lie, and A is the defendant, B is the state, C is society, I don't know, whatever.
Wait, so the civil is gonna be the opposite. It's gonna be, burden is gonna be for the
Accused.
No, the accused is for the, criminal trial, the burden of.
Okay, in a criminal trial, you have the state and the defendant.
Yes, and
Who are the litigants in the civil trial?
two people.
Yes, but what do we call the two?
The accuser and the defendant.
The plaintiff and the defendant, okay? Who's the burden of proof on? In a civil case. The plaintiff is on, now, is the burden of proof the same in criminal,
No,
in civil? What is the burden of proof in criminal?
criminal
Yes.
should be for the accused.
What does the state has to prove the defendant's guilt
Yeah.
to what standard? What? That's a very popular notion, but it's not really correct. In other words, there could be, it doesn't have to be without a shadow of doubt, suggesting that there can be no doubt whatsoever. There may be some doubt, okay? Still, there may be some doubt, but it's actually beyond a reasonable doubt. It's beyond a reasonable doubt, okay? Now, what is the burden of proof on the defendant in a civil case? The plaintiff is accusing the defendant of destroying his property. And the defendant is saying, I didn't do it. I don't know who did it, but what's the plaintiff going to have to do?
Yeah, we can have an outline.
But what we're talking about, how much evidence, right? In a criminal trial, the state is going to have to put on enough evidence to remove reasonable doubt,
Correct.
right? In a civil case, the plaintiff is going to have to bring forward enough evidence to do what?
Maintain reasonable
No.
doubt.
The phrase is preponderance of evidence, okay?
I would have never guessed that.
Right, is the preponderance of evidence weighted toward the plaintiff's case, or is it weighted towards, in other words, it's not as high of a standard, it's not as high of a bar to clear as the criminal case, right? And why is that, do you think? Why do you think there's a higher bar? Why don't we just apply the preponderance of evidence standard to criminal cases?
Because
You're dealing with
You're talking about someone's freedom.
One's going to prison.
Right, you're talking about someone's freedom. Whereas in a civil case, if it's a tort case, as we call them, property damage case, say, you're really just talking about property. Yeah, I mean, I think that's as simple as that in a criminal case, the reason the standard of proof on the state is higher is because you're talking about taking someone's freedom away from them, potentially.
What about
about, the significance of Smith versus Albright?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. And that's definitely something that we talked about in our treatment of in class. I mean, it's dealt with in the textbook too. You see, these items could be based on stuff in the textbook. It could be based on stuff that we covered in lecture, or it could be something that we covered in both. This is something that is covered both in the textbook and we covered in class in our topic on voting rights. And it has to do with the white primary, so-called white primary. Remember that?
Pretty sure.
Wait, say that one more time.
What part?
That last part you were talking about, it dealt with.
The case Smith versus Albright has to do with the so-called white primary.
Can we talk about the white primary?
Did we talk about it?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Maybe, but-
Is that what you just said to me? Did we talk? You bet. Absolutely.
That does that have to do with like, people trying to restrict the right votes of minorities?
Yes,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
specifically,
They were trying.
and specifically in this instance, not just any minorities, but specifically African Americans.
And they were they doing it like literacy?
Well, you did have that, but the white primary is something very specific, right?
Oh, no, was it their family members?
No?
No, that was.
The white primary, who remembers?
Okay, they were done in Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, and Georgia.
Well, yeah, the South generally, but since we are, of course, in Texas government, we talk about it specifically with respect to Texas. And Smith versus Albright was a case that came out of Texas.
It's where only white voters were allowed to exercise right to vote.
African Americans were not allowed to vote generally.
Wait.
I think in
Primary
state
elections.
elections,
In what primary?
state election.
Yes.
Because it's a state, not a federal, so they thought they had to.
But wasn't it?
That's not what I'm getting at. The Democratic Party primary. Okay, that's important. Why is that important, Darian?
Because they have the power to choose who gets to vote.
That's really where elections were decided in Texas and most places in the South for a long, long, long period of time because Republicans could not win in the general election. Okay? There was a long period of Southern history, Texas is part of that, where if you were Republican, forget it. You're not winning in the general election. So the real action was in the Democratic Party primary. So if African American voters could be kept out of the Democratic Party primary, then they really had no role in the election of a governor or the election of state representatives or whatever the elections were. They could vote in the general election. African Americans could vote in the general election, but it was already decided at that point.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's why it's important to remember that it's the Democratic Party primary. Okay? Now the question is, well, what is Smith versus Albright?
Was that when, or?
We talked about 3 cases directly related to the white primary, the use of the white primary in the Democratic Party in Texas.
It was a landmark decision.
Nixon versus Henderson.
What?
Nixon versus Henderson.
One more time, I'm sorry.
I'm saying Nixon versus.
Oh, that was one of the 3 that we talked about. Grovey versus Townsend was the other one.
So it overturned Texas state law that authorized parties to set their internal rules.
Okay, I'm going to give you the quick review here real quick, but you're going to have to go back and look at the details, okay? So, for many years after the Civil War, down to about the 1920s, it was just sort of the practice in Texas. If you were an African American voter and you showed up at the Democratic Party primary, they would say, "Get out of here. We don't let your kind vote here." Okay? Now, in I think sometime in the 1920s, I can't remember the exact date, but you can look back at your notes. the Texas legislature decided to codify that into state law. They actually wrote a law in Austin that prohibited African Americans from voting in the Democratic Party primary. And you understand that's despite the 15th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which says that the states can't deprive a person the right to vote on the basis of race, creed, color, or previous condition of servitude. But the state of Texas essentially was taking the position, well, we're not denying the right to vote. They can still vote in the general election. Right? As irrelevant as may be to vote in the general election in those years, right? So Texas makes this law, and that goes before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says that you can't do that, right? That's a violation. So then the Democratic Party of Texas just writes it in its rules, right? And then that goes before the Supreme Court, and the court says, well, the Democratic Party is a private organization, and it can have whatever rules that it wants, right? But then in Smith versus Allwright, which is really the most important of the three, the other two are only important in terms of context. But Smith versus Allwright is the one where the Supreme Court finally puts the white primary to bed, so to speak, or puts the nail in the coffin on the white primary and says, the Democratic Party is operating as an agent of the state of Texas. It is running the election for the state of Texas, and therefore the prohibition against the state depriving the right to vote on the basis of race, creed, color, previous condition of servitude applies. Okay? Yeah, so Smith versus Allwright is a critical case. That's finally the end of the white primary. What else? While you're thinking of another one, I wish I'd remembered to mention this in the previous class. While you're thinking of another question here, and it's on my mind, so I don't forget it. You do have a week 15 discussion board, and the week 15 discussion board will provide additional opportunity for review for the final exam. That's going to be the basis of it. Is I'm going to put out versus pairs out there based on what we talked about here in class today, or if I need to, I'll go back into the study guide and I'll pull out concepts that you can write up as a versus pair for week 15.
I love this one right here.
Go ahead, X.
How to describe the various types of opinions that may be written by appellate court judges?
Okay, remind me which SLO that is?
SLO 4, sorry.
It's okay.
Kind of in the middle.
So this is something that really we didn't get into in class,
Yeah.
but is covered in the reading material. So I guess the first thing to make sure that you're clear on is the difference between a court of original jurisdiction and a court of appellate jurisdiction. So a court of original jurisdiction is a trial court. It's usually presided over by one judge, okay? Like say district courts, okay? And courts of original jurisdiction, trial courts, are really interested in questions of fact, what happened, and how to reconcile that with the law, with the existing law, okay? Courts of appellate jurisdiction, appellate courts, generally have more than one judge, okay? It's a panel of judges or panel of justices, usually an odd number to break ties, okay? And they are dealing with questions of application of law. Was the law applied correctly? Right, so there's what some people might say interpretation of law. Interpretation and application of law. So in the interpretation of anything, including the interpretation of law, and you have more than one person who has a say on it, like we do on appellate court benches, 3, 5, 7, 9, whatever we're talking about the U.S. Supreme Court, for example, 9, right? You're bound to have differing opinions, right? About what the law says, what it means, how it's supposed to be applied. But they don't just have these differing opinions that they say, different opinions. When they decide a case, assuming, for example, that it's not a unanimous decision of the court, maybe it's a split decision. Let's say it's a 6-3 decision, or a 5-4 decision, or a 7-2 decision, whatever. Okay, so we're always interested in how appellate courts decide cases. What is the decision of the majority of this court? But we're also interested in the reasoning behind their decisions. And so the justices or judges on the appellate court will write out their opinions. And in the study of the law, it's very important to look at the opinions. Okay? So let's say it's a 5-4 decision. In that block of 5 justices, one of those justices will be assigned to write the opinion for the majority, why it reached the conclusion that it reached, what provisions of law are relevant, or if the Constitution is at issue here, what provisions of the Constitution are relevant. Okay? What led them to this decision? Maybe it's a situation where you have 5 who decide the case who are in the majority, and 3 of them reach the conclusion for one set of reasons, and 2 reach the conclusion for a different set of reasons. They may write what are called concurring opinions. Okay? There's also something called a controlling opinion, but we'll leave that aside. Okay? Or there may be something called a controlling opinion. Okay? If it's a unanimous decision of the court, like say a case like Brown versus the Board of Education, okay, the Supreme Court, famous Supreme Court decision, where all 9 justices were in agreement, and the Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the unanimous opinion of the court, laying out the reasons why you can't segregate on the basis of race in public elementary and secondary schools. Does that make sense? Now, how about the ones that, if it's a split decision, the ones who are in the minority, the ones who don't agree with the majority? They may write one or more dissenting opinions. And dissenting opinions can be important. Sometimes, at least occasionally, a dissenting opinion will become the basis of a majority opinion later on. For example, the dissenting opinion of Justice Harlan 1 in Plessy versus Ferguson way back in 1896 became the basis of the majority opinion or the unanimous opinion of the Supreme Court in the aforementioned Brown versus the Board of Education. So Justice Harlan 1 way back in 1896 was saying that the Constitution doesn't tolerate this kind of racial segregation, and it really became the basis of what the Supreme Court in a unanimous decision decided 60 years later in Brown versus the Board of Education. But we have appellate courts at the state level in Texas here as well, right? So you're going to have, start at the top level, right? You have 2 Supreme Courts in Texas, right? And the Texas Supreme Court, which deals with what kind of cases? Civil cases, right, civil matters. And there are 9 justices on the Texas Supreme Court, so you could have these split decisions, and they're going to write their differing opinions and so on, right? What is the court for criminal cases called? The Supreme Court in Texas, the criminal cases. It's called the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. It's the highest court in Texas for criminal cases. And it also has 9 justices. And so they can have split decisions there as well. So you've got majority opinions, you've got controlling opinions, you've got concurring opinions, you've got dissenting opinions. That's what this one is really referring to. Okay? But now, X, you asked that question, right? Yeah. You know, why is that important to understand that you have all these different, you could potentially have these differing opinions? Well, that's how we sort out what the law says, what the law means. We rely on the courts to do that for us. But we have to understand that courts don't, when you have these panels of justices or panels of judges, they don't always come away with unanimous decisions. In fact, most decisions are not unanimous decisions. So the idea that there could be different opinions on the law is an important thing to understand. I mean, we would like it. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the world worked that way, that everything was just so clear in the law that there would be no differing or competing opinions, right? There would be no, we wouldn't have to talk about controlling opinions and concurring opinions and majority opinions, and we certainly wouldn't have to talk about dissenting opinions. If it was so clear, if the law was so clean and clear and obvious and so on, we wouldn't have to study stuff like this in a course like this. More importantly, Americans generally wouldn't need to concern themselves with the fact that there might be differing opinions on the law. They call them opinions, okay? That's not my term, that's a long-held term. But to be sure, they're educated opinions, right? They're not just like anybody's opinion off the street.
What about, the several types of federal grants and aid?
Oh, yeah, that's something that, again, it was in that package of material that was iced out, okay? So it's related to that topic on federalism, and I really didn't get into it much in my lectures anyway. So you'd have to rely on the information in the textbook in the chapter on federalism. Okay? But it is a big part of federalism. These grants that these federal grants that they talk about in that chapter, I think it's chapter 3, is a big part of understanding how federalism works in practice. Right? We can talk about the constitutional aspects of federalism all day long. We can talk about, constitutional provisions related to federalism, etc. But if we don't understand the political realities that are best represented by this grants and aid system, then we're not going to have a very complete picture of how federalism works in the United States. Got about 5 minutes. You want to take advantage of it. Anything else? Everybody feel confident about the final, or do you still need some study time? You couldn't take it right now. Anybody want to take it right now?
I'll could, but I don't know if I'll be in 5 minutes.
I don't have to.
Maybe I could.
You need a little more study time, is what you're telling me. It's a lot of material, but I've been honest with you guys about that from the very beginning.
I think the stuff that I missed on the freeze, that's what I'm gonna have to look over.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important chunk of material. In fact, I told you at the time, if I could have picked a week of the semester, if somebody had said, we have to have 1 week of the semester where we get some weather phenomenon that cancels classes, I would not have picked that week. That would have been like at the bottom of my list because all the data from all the final exams that we administered over the years has kind of leads to the conclusion that the one SLO that students seem to struggle with the most is the one that deals with federalism.
Got it.
Yeah.
You should have done that and skip the taxes.
Should have what?
Should have done the federalism and skip the taxes.
Keep the taxes to myself.
Well, you don't mind.
All right, if you guys have no other questions, we'll call it a day, and I'll see you 1 week from today. Remember, 12:30.
12:30. 12:30.
You have a good weekend.
Thanks, you too.